Good morning, friends. I'd like to take you back to Romans chapter 3, verse 26 this morning, which reads, "It was to show his righteousness," meaning God's righteousness, "at the present time, so that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus." Based on this verse, I just want to offer a particular perspective, perhaps a different perspective than maybe you've been exposed to before, on how we view our salvation. Because we talked a lot about words lately. We've gone over a lot of definitions, and I hope we've seen how that's a really good thing as we dive deeper into our understanding of God, our position in relationship to Him, and the salvation He offers. And I mention this because the word salvation, despite the fact that we use it all the time, I just did, and it's absolutely a biblical term to use, in today's day and age, it's actually a very generic term. As we've mentioned before, you might ask a person, "Are you saved?" And the response is likely to be, saved from what? Saved from sin? Saved from a car accident? Saved from having to spend a holiday with annoying relatives? And while Paul and the other writers of Scripture absolutely do talk about having such a great salvation, I want to encourage you to put your default perspective about your salvation at the more specific level of justification. Saying "I am saved" is completely accurate, but it's much less precise than saying "I am justified." And we might say, well, why are we worried about such a small difference? We're talking about the same thing, right? Why worry about which specific word you use? And you're right, we are talking about the same thing, but oftentimes using a more precise word carries so much more weight and power with it. And I admit this is somewhat subjective, so weigh this out for yourself. All I know is that the Spirit inspired the Scripture authors to use the words they did for a reason, and sometimes the words sometimes the words are more general, but sometimes they are far more specific, and those specific words seem to carry so much more depth and power and oomph when we understand them properly, as opposed to those easier to understand but more generic terms. Because if we're struggling with sin, we might try comforting ourselves by reminding ourselves, "But I'm saved. God has saved me." And sometimes the enemy whispers in our ear, "Oh, but has he? Has he really saved you? You've been an awfully naughty Christian. You haven't really lived up to his expectations, have you? Has he really saved you?" And oh friends, the enemy is a wily one, and he will cast doubt on your salvation whenever he can. But when we struggle with that sin, and we then remind ourselves, "But I am justified. God has justified me. He's declared me righteous." Well then, when the enemy says, "Oh, but has he really? You've done some naughty things," then the very word itself, justified, reminds us that what we're relying on, where our comfort comes from, is all about God's declaration, and it has nothing to do with our working for it, whether to get it or even to keep it. Because again, being justified doesn't mean being righteous, but rather to be declared righteous. And so when the enemy, who is so good at accusing God's people, makes those accusations against you, you can say, "I know I'm not righteous in myself, but that's not the point. I am justified because of Christ's righteousness and not my own." And in that is a very specific comfort. God has given us words, and the words He has given us are powerful. Let us come to grip with these words of strength and comfort and power, and above all, let us thank God for His Son Jesus, who is the Word made flesh. And I pray this gives you comfort indeed. Have a good and godly day, and if the Lord wills, I will see you tomorrow.